Righty-ho, the doors are closed. We have made contact finally, and thank goodness we have, with Yossi, Klein and Halevi, who is from the Shalom Hartman Institute and is going to bring our conference day to a close now. And I think if it's all right with you, Yossi, we will extend our timing slightly and give you a full 20 minutes or so. I wanted to start with something that you recently wrote about what is happening at the moment in Israel and in Gaza. And you talked about this word existential when it comes to the threats to Israel. And you made a distinction, which I thought was a really interesting one, between a kind of immediate existential threat and a longer term one. Tell us what you were getting at and what people need to understand about what's happening at the moment.
So first of all, hi everyone, and thank you for having me here. I think one of the most extraordinary aspects of this moment is how quickly, in fact, instantly, Israeli society pivoted from being at the most divided moment in its history, which was really this last year. Many of us were out on the streets literally every week, sometimes more than once a week. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis demonstrating throughout the year to try to bring this government down. And then October 7th happens, and suddenly on October 8th, Israel is at one of its peak moments of unity. And that extends from the left through the center to the right. We've more or less suspended the very deep divides in the society. And we've rallied around for a simple reason, because there is this very profound perception, again, across the political spectrum, that this is an existential moment. But as you note, the distinction that I was making in that article was that no one seriously believes that if we fail to defeat Hamas, Israel will be immediately in danger existentially. We're really looking at a turning point in how Israel is perceived in the region. And if the lasting image of Israel is October 7th, which is to say a country that was unable to defend its citizens from within its own borders. Don't forget that Israel 50 years ago sent commandos halfway across Africa to rescue 100 Israelis hijacked at Entebbe airport. And that was one very, very important image of Israel, which is essential for Israel's long-term survival. And that is what our deterrence has been based on. October 7th is on the opposite end of that spectrum. October 7th was the exposure of Israel as weak, as unable to fulfill its most basic commitment to the Jewish people, which was never again. And never again was not about promising that never again would there be attempted genocide against the Jews, but that never again would the Jews be in a position where we wouldn't be able to defend ourselves. And October 7th was a kind of, the way we experienced it was a kind of a mini pre-enactment of Hamas's genocidal vision. And we were completely powerless to stop them, again, within our own borders. And so this is a war to restore Israeli deterrence. And if we fail, if Hamas remains in power at the end of this war, if this results in one more stalemate, then the consequences will be that, first of all, the enemies on our other borders will begin prying for further signs of weakness. We will be inviting more October 7th. And one of the leaders of Hamas just said in an interview the other day, October 7th was just the beginning. There will be many more October 7th. And so this is a war, first of all, to restore the credibility of Israeli deterrence. And if I could just add one last point here. Yeah. I've been haunted by something that Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, said about 20 years ago. In one of his speeches, he famously compared Israel to a spider web. And just as a spider web seems on the surface to be impenetrable, and as soon as you swipe it, it disintegrates, that's true for Israel. And of course, the Iranians have been saying this. The Iranian regime has been saying this for years. There's a doomsday clock ticking away in Tehran, leading up to the deadline that Ayatollah Khamenei said Israel, at the point when Israel will be destroyed, and I think it was in 2015 or 2016, he said Israel has another 25 years to go. And so this is a war to beat that clock, to beat the doomsday clock for Israel. It's a war to push back against Nasrallah's frankly compelling and credible vision. As of October 7th, that is a credible assessment of Israel's capabilities. And for that reason, we have a level of national unity that not only that we've rarely had before, certainly not in the last decades, but that stands in total contrast to what we were experiencing here in the last year.
Yossi, what does success look like?
The Hamas leadership is either eliminated or is allowed to fly to Qatar and join the other part of Hamas's leadership in Qatar or Turkey. And the Hamas leadership cannot remain in place by the end of this war.
And after that, what? I mean, in other words, when Western leaders, nervous about their own electorates, concerned about their own party splits, we've just had a discussion about the United States and the way in which there are some elements in the modern Democratic Party that are not at one with Joe Biden. When they come to Israeli leaders, whether it's Netanyahu or someone in the future, and say, okay, then you have successfully taken Hamas out of Gaza, what is the step beyond that?
So there's a preliminary step before that conversation can happen. And that is that Netanyahu and his government must fall. And we have precedent for that in Israel. In fact, we have three precedents of leaders, prime ministers who resigned in the wake of wars that were perceived to be failures. I'm thinking of Ehud Olmert in the Second Lebanon War of 2006, and Menachem Begin in the wake of the First Lebanon War in 1983. The war began in 82. He resigned a year later. And of course, Golda Meir in the Yom Kippur War. Now, what's interesting is that each of those, with the exception of the First Lebanon War, the Yom Kippur War and the Second Lebanon War in 2006 were actually successful, but that wasn't the public perception. In fact, I would say that the Yom Kippur War was probably Israel's most impressive strategic victory, more so than the Six-Day War, because we were taken by surprise on two fronts, and within 10 days, we had turned the war around. This war is virtually unanimously perceived as a disaster before it even began. More Israelis were killed on the first day of this war than died in 5 years of suicide bombings in the Second Intifada of the early 2000s. And so this government does not have a chance, to my mind, of surviving the popular rage that we're going to experience here. The day after the soldiers come back from the front, the war turns inward, and it's about bringing down this government. And I believe that will happen fairly quickly. So what happens in Gaza in the interim, hopefully the Palestinian Authority steps in. Hopefully there'll be Saudi and Gulf state support. But in terms of what Israel needs to do in the immediate aftermath of this war is to bring down this government. Nothing positive can happen in the aftermath of this war as long as this government is in power. And so.
And when it comes to Israeli politics, you made very clear what you think will happen with Netanyahu. What in the longer term does this do to Israeli politics and society, do you think? Again, assuming success or relative success in the war that has started now, how does Israel change?
I think we're going to see two contradictory political developments. On the one hand, there will be a strengthening, and I fear a substantial strengthening, of the far right. This event, I would call this the single most traumatic event in the history of Israel. And that's saying a lot. I've lived in Israel for 40 years, and it has been a roller coaster, but nothing compares to this moment. Nothing since the 1948 war, which truly was existential, can compare to the trauma of October 7th. And it's complicated because the world has moved on. And I understand why. The mounting casualties in Gaza, the news cycle moves on. But in Israel, we've just begun to process this. This is going to take us months, if not years, to internalize. And the immediate beneficiary, I believe, will be the far right. But the more, I think, the more substantive political transformation here will be a strengthening of the Israeli center. We see it in every poll since the massacre. In fact, we've seen it in every poll for the last few months. The Netanyahu government, even before the massacre, had lost a large percentage of its own voters. And the polls now show a rout for this government. So what I suspect will happen is that the hardcore Likud supporters will abandon the Likud, which is seen now as a failed party. Many of them will go to the far right. But a majority of Israelis will come out of this anguished year, a year where we, first of all, tore ourselves apart internally over the judicial coup, the attempted judicial coup of this far right government. And then that segued into the single most traumatic day in the history of Israel. And when you put those two events together, one was the disintegration of Israel socially, and the other was the disintegration of Israeli power. What the majority of Israelis will crave most of all is stability, is a coming together, finding some common ground, because I think most of us realize that what we went through in this last year led directly to this disaster, led directly to October 7th, because our enemies rightly perceived weakness and divisiveness within Israeli society. The army was warning Netanyahu for months, and there was nothing secret about this. It was headline news. And military intelligence was telling Netanyahu, if you don't stop the your judicial revolution, we're going to have war. They perceive weakness, and they're going to exploit that weakness. Netanyahu ignored them. And so what Israelis will want after this is some new vision of how we work together as a society. This is an extremely fractured society. Not only do we have Jews here from literally 100 countries, but we also have 20% of our population are Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so to find some minimal consensus will require new ground rules. We're going to need a constitution, which we don't have. We're going to need some way in which both sides, all sides, left, center, and right, agree that when one coalition comes to power, it doesn't try to impose the totality of its worldview on the other half of the country. That's what led to the breakdown of Israeli society in the last year, and that had grave security consequences. So I think the paradox will be a strengthening on the minority of the far right and the majority strengthening the center.
Yossi, I'm going to pause there in case there are questions here from our audience who've been listening to you with rapt attention, and there are certainly a couple. So can we start with a microphone? Yeah, there's a gentleman at the back who has a microphone, then we're going to bring it right to the front, and this lady here, please. So if you could maybe just, so that Yossi can get a sense of who everyone is, if you just say who you are and then ask, and I'll pass things on if he doesn't hear it.
Yeah, Tim Montgomery from the Times newspaper. Can I ask you to comment on the argument that the settlements in the West Bank have been such a diversion for the IDF, that a lot of IDF resources have been devoted to protecting the settlements there, that they were distracted from other defense duties in Israel that helped cause the terrible events of the 7th of October?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It happened literally in the days before October 7th, when soldiers were moved from the Gaza border to protect settlers in the West Bank. This war, I believe, will seriously weaken the argument of the pro-settlement camp that settlements are essential for our security. I think the opposite is true. Certainly the settlements that are deep in the West Bank. You know that there's the map, the settlement map is complicated. You have about 70 to 80% of settlers who live near the old 1967 border. And any peace plan makes provisions for incorporating those settlements within the borders of sovereign Israel. And President Clinton, for example, envisioned a land swap where Israel would offer territory from within sovereign pre-67 Israel in exchange for those settlement blocks. And about 20 to 30% of the settlers will find themselves outside the settlement blocks, out in perhaps a future Palestinian state. And so, but this fundamental argument, which was so essential for the mainstreaming of the settlement movement, this notion that we must hold on to the settlements because it's essential for our security, I think that has been dealt a very serious blow. On the other hand, and in Israel, there's always another hand. On the other hand, Israelis are going to come out of this war saying, if we were to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, we would be inviting Gaza onto our most sensitive border, the West Bank highlands, which overlooks Greater Tel Aviv and Ben Gurion Airport. And 70% of the Israeli infrastructure is on the coastal plain beneath the highlands of the West Bank. And so there is a very powerful counter-argument here for not creating a Palestinian state. And this is something that I hope, as someone who believes that it is in Israel's existential interest to move toward a two-state solution, but also agrees with those who argue that a Palestinian state that's created prematurely will be an existential threat to Israel. I believe that the only way that we can navigate this paradox of existential need and existential threat is by involving the region in a solution. This conflict, the Middle East conflict, is perceived by outsiders to be primarily an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israelis perceive this very differently. we perceive the Middle East conflict to be precisely that, a conflict between the Middle East, the Arab, and parts of the Muslim world, and the Jewish state. That's how we've lived this conflict for 75 years. Now, there's a chance, there is a serious chance for ending the Middle East conflict, or at least the Sunni-Israeli conflict. And that's by bringing Saudi Arabia into the circle of peace. Once we do that, there's a basis, first of all, for reassuring Israeli anxieties about the threat, the security danger of a Palestinian threat, and to solving the Palestinian tragedy in a regional context. And that means tremendous economic investments in a future Palestinian state. Because if a Palestinian state were created tomorrow on the basis of what exists now, it will be one more failed Middle Eastern state. Everyone knows it. And so we need to think about a Palestinian state as a long-term process, but that means on the Israeli side that when this war is over and this government falls, we're going to need a settlement freeze, certainly in the settlements outside the blocks, and to begin a very cautious process of shifting us away from the direction in which we're moving now, which is toward annexation and a binational state, toward an eventual, and I keep emphasizing, eventual two-state solution.
Okay, one more question. There's a lady at the front here. Yes, microphone's right next to you. Okay.
Thank you. Yossi, it's a pleasure to have you here today and listen to your views. My name's Laura Roberts. I'm the board of the UK Abraham Accords Group. And I wanted really just to kind of hear, after the progress of the past 3 years, what you think about the future, and also the concerns that the Abraham Accord countries have currently, largely because their own population on the street may not have bought into the accords in the same way the governments have.
I really appreciate the question. I would say that there are two factors here. One is, as you mentioned, the pressure on the street. The other is a deep disappointment within those countries that either have already made peace with us, Arab countries, or countries like Saudi Arabia that were seriously considering it. A deep disappointment that Israel allowed October 7th to happen. And one of the main incentives, in fact, I would say the incentive for the Abraham Accords countries and for the Saudis to make peace with Israel is because we were perceived as a powerful country. And I was in Morocco not long ago, and the way that this was explained to me is that the Middle East is divided into two camps: the camps of countries that are looking to the future and countries that are disintegrating because they're prisoners of the past. And Israel was perceived as belonging to the camp of the future. Now, this last year, this government, this Israeli government, put one strain on that premise. The second strain now is that we are a strong country that you can depend on, certainly to counter Iran. I think that the Saudis are furious at us and the Gulf states. And again, I'm not speaking necessarily about the street, but the elites. They're furious at Israel, not for what we're doing in Gaza, but for taking so long and for not destroying Hamas definitively. And I know this because this was true in the past when Israel and Hamas fought in previous conflicts, and we allowed the Hamas regime to remain in power. The pushback behind the scenes from Arab leaders was devastating, including from Jordan and Egypt, who are among our most vociferous public critics. Genocide and all the rest of it. Behind the scenes, why are you leaving Hamas in power? This is your opportunity. And so what's at stake here in the Israeli victory is not only restoring our deterrence, but restoring our appeal as a partner for a future Middle East, restoring our credibility as a powerful country. And what's at stake, and what's at stake, I think, as a corollary of that, is the only hope that we have for solving the Palestinian problem, which is within a regional context of Israel with Arab partners.
Yossi, thank you so much. There's going to be a rather thunderous round of applause now. I'm slightly worried about your headphones, but here it is anyway.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking the time and patience, because I think we had some trouble getting through to you, but thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure.
Truly a pleasure. Thank you all.